Hi, everyone. My name is Lovette Jallow, and welcome to my first episode of Lovette or Leave It. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an author, speaker, advocate, and I specialize in neurodiversity, DEI, intersectionality, and also human rights. I'm also somebody who loves going deep into the things that are part of the human condition, but we often overlook. Those are the dynamics that shape how we connect and care and also build community and preserve community. Now, this podcast is where I'm going to be unpacking some of these topics, one conversation at a time. So it will be a mix of storytelling, reflections, and of course, a huge dose of honesty. So let's get into today's topic. I am going to be talking about one-sided conversations, what autistic loneliness is and feels like for some, and also the deeper reasons that I'm thinking about behind why communication sometimes feels so hard. Because I don't think that it's just an autistic experience. I think it's a feeling many of us experience, but we don't always have the words to describe it. It's a particular type of loneliness, and some people mistake it for just being lonely. But that specific kind of isolation where you can be surrounded by people, yet feel unseen, unheard, but also misunderstood. Let's get into it now. So, what does loneliness actually mean for someone who's autistic? Because I hear it all the time. I see many posts about it. And sometimes I feel like I can't relate because that feeling of loneliness that most people describe doesn't really resonate with me. And if we started from autism is a spectrum, so we won't be defining things as for everyone because it's also an internal feeling. So I'm going to be speaking a lot from my experience and my thoughts and my analysis based also on observations and my work that I do and how I observe online communities being built. And one thing that stands out, sometimes as a joke, but many times is very much deadpan. People are serious. And it's part of the DSM. People assume that autistics struggle with conversational dynamics. What I mean by that is things like throwing and catching, where you're supposed to seamlessly throw words and curiosity back and forth. But when you really pay attention, you'll notice that most people, whether they're autistic, neurotypical or not, in 2025, it's become more apparent to me than ever before that most people aren't that curious about other people's inner worlds. And it can also be correlated to how curious they are to their own inner worlds. So that's when I started thinking that perhaps autistic loneliness is not just autistic, it's a human struggle. But then I thought even deeper about it, and I was like, there's something that hits different for autistic people because the loneliness we're describing has nothing to do with being physically alone, which most of us love. It's the feeling of being surrounded by human beings and realizing no one is meeting you with the same depth and curiosity that you are offering them. Even in small ways like how we show love. It's like opening a door for someone and waiting for them to open theirs only to realize they've left you standing in the doorway. And today, it hit me particularly hard because as per usual, I have delayed processing. So I can process things for a year and a half until one day the penny drops for me and I find the words to explain what I'm thinking, how I'm feeling. So this hit me particularly hard today because I took 2 taxis for a meeting. Both ways were 1 hour long, two different taxi drivers. And both times, the drivers, beyond asking me about my destination to start a conversation, started waxing lyrically about their lives. They shared thoughts on religion, their travels, former clients, and their personal philosophies on life. It wasn't because I was engaging them, and it also wasn't because I was ignoring them. I was just listening. But I barely spoke. I think I spoke 3 sentences in both rides. And this is a common thing for me because I do take taxis quite frequently. And barely having spoken, I noticed they're clearly driven by a need to be heard during these 1 hour drives. And old me, and I'll get to that soon, old me would have interacted and given the right social cues. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, are you sure? Well, how did that feel like? To dig deeper. But I didn't this time, just to check if my thesis is kind of accurate here. I've done it before. This would be the 50th time in the last 12 months I've done this, just to see if my silence would prompt them to ask questions and be curious. Because being intermittently non-speaking autistic, I can go days, sometimes weeks, being silent and communicating in other ways, and I feel no discomfort in that. But talking is something I do for a living, is something I have won awards for. But outside of that, I see speech, verbalizing, these days as something that needs to have a reason, a purpose. So when you see me talking excitedly to someone, whether I know them before or they're new to my life, there's a portal that's been opened where we are mutually deeply interested and curious either about a topic we share or each other and how we see the world. But these interactions today reminded me of what I knew, how starved people are to feel heard. But so many few seem curious about actually listening or creating a sort of reciprocal exchange with the human being in front of them. Then it dawned on me, because I always go back into myself, how much energy we autistics, for many reasons, can sometimes create safe spaces and pour into understanding others as a means of understanding ourselves. So much so that we can create safety for people even in silence. We create safety for their words. We hold space without judgment and genuinely try to meet people where they are. And this is not unilateral for all autistics, by the way. I'm just speaking, again, from my point of view and what I have noticed in autistic communities, especially that I belong to, is that curiosity of the world, like, hard to describe, but just meeting people where they are. And then one day you wake up and you realize the care, the curiosity, the safety you offer aren't being reciprocated. And that's what I'm speaking of. Like, there's something societal that happens, which is why I don't want to restrict this just for the autistic experience, but I think they hear me and they feel what I'm saying. People speak as if they're starved to express themselves, but they don't actually include others in the conversation. And when they feel like they need to include others, they revert to small talk. It's like they've forgotten that dialogue, proper dialogue, is a two-way street. For autistics, this feels magnified because we can create that safe space for people, whether in silence or speaking, but they are not attempting to do the same, perhaps because they're constantly speaking. They are not taking time to observe, which is why even my friends who are non-verbal, non-speaking, show more care sometimes than people who can ask questions verbally and get a direct answer from me. Because to be nonverbal and also intermittently non-speaking means to navigate this world and actually observe more, because you know communication is more than your words. So I am constantly observing the people I love, how they're changing and growing to find new ways to love them in their new phase of life. Body language, changes in voice tone, their new desires in life, their new goals, asking questions like, where do you see yourself with this? What was your intent with that? Not to attack anyone, which is sometimes something many people misunderstand with autistic people. We're asking questions to dig into your life and you because we're genuinely curious. And maybe that's intoxicating when someone's in front of you and you're digging into the pieces that make the giant cake of their humanness. It is intoxicating because look at society right now. There are not too many safe spaces. You're at work, you're masked up. You are actually masking your true self. Most people are. If you're self-employed, you're constantly having to drive conversations back to the work you do. And then you have friendships that are constantly changing. And many people lack bravery to understand that friendship is more than the time you've spent together. Sometimes your roads diverge, not because you outgrow the person, but because your roads, one is going to Las Vegas and one is going to Los Angeles. You might meet again, but for now, you're too far apart. And saying we have known each other for 10 years cannot sustain a relationship. So we just stick around in these spaces. So of course, when you meet someone who's genuinely curious, it feels different. Or as the kids say, it hits different. And I also found out that in my writing, in my analysis, this might be why so many autistics, especially when we were younger, talk about calling people our friends who were never truly our friends. It's not just about us missing subtle social cues. I think oftentimes we're on top of those social cues. We just decide when we wish to ignore them. It's about us assuming the emotional labor that we're putting into these relationships is mutual. And spoiler alert, it often isn't. I had a conversation with a friend last year, at the end of last year, where I was like, when we were friends before, why didn't you do X, Y, Z for me? Because I'm more verbal now about my needs. And her response to me was, I didn't consider you a friend. I was like, I considered you a sister, family. And I treated you as such. And I had to sit with that for a long time because how was I showing love and space and holding space and exerting so much effort because I was autistically masked then. And the person really wasn't feeling the feeling back. We had to rebuild that now. And I think here's the kicker. Many of us grew up in environments where this dynamic was also modeled for us. And I'm not talking about just trauma here. 80% of autistics have trauma in their life. It's blended into autism from our caregivers, from our friends and our partners. And there'll be a special episode on what that looks like. But it can be something as innocuous as being raised by an undiagnosed autistic parent, because if you are, one of your parents is, or both, that undiagnosed parent maybe navigated the world in the same way we are now, feeling that loneliness, stifling themselves and masking, that when they came home, we were the ones to listen to their special interests and excitement about things that no one else cares about. We understood their way of communication. And we provide for them safety, but never quite received it back. So we can grow up internalizing the idea that this is how relationships are. This is just how it is. But then one day, it dawns on you. Most of our conversations we exert ourselves to have, the tools we learn because we are the ones supposedly needing to adapt. Well, most of that emotional labor has been one-sided. You've been curating and creating safety for others, but it wasn't returned. And I have to say, I've watched people have this type of realization, and I think I had mine in 2023. It's isolating, but it's also eye-opening because you start to see who really sees you because you start seeing yourself. And you also recognize who is just there to take what you offer. But they may not even have the capacity to meet you, but they claim we autistics have the deficit. But then society has a deficit because it's not natural to not have curiosity or read the body expressions of another human being. Communication is more than the verbal. Now, I started wondering even more because my questions never end somewhere. I was thinking, is this type of loneliness amplified by neurotype, but it's on a societal level? This lack of curiosity. Because let's face it, we live in a world that prioritizes self-presentation over connection. Social media encourages us to broadcast, but how often do we pause to intake and listen and analyze? And when we do, are we truly curious about the inner lives of others? Are we even curious about our own inner lives and our trajectory? Because it feels like there's a performative communication that leaves very little room for depth. And for me, as autistic, that absence of depth is unbearable. And yes, when you realize it and you get that gut punch, yes, it's isolating. Yes, it's clarity. But there's also a moment of grief. There's a deep, profound sense of grief where you grieve the time, the energy that you've spent on relationships where you weren't truly seen. For me, it was like peeling back layers of onions of reality I hadn't questioned. I thought to myself, but this is just how people are. This is just what relationships look like. But being gut punched by realization, it forced me to start redefining what I actually want, which spaces I want to be in, and what I feel like I can communicate that I want in relationship. Because it's not enough to just write it down or think about it, but how do you communicate it to people as well? Now, when I notice people, and you will see on my Substack, I'm writing quite a lot dissecting relationships. Now, these days, when I notice people engaging in one-sided dynamics, I have to say I don't hesitate to step back. Not because I'm unkind, but because I have to protect my capacity, my brain capacity, and also where I want to redirect energy, and that is relationships that offer mutuality. For me, it taught me deeply to prioritize relationships where curiosity and care flows both ways. I don't think reciprocity is too much to ask for because it's the foundation of all meaningful relationships, even professional ones. And like I said, 2023, I started unmasking. It was a painful process. And I just don't know how to explain what that process is like. I'm formulating it because I need to express that. I just don't have the capacity to sit somewhere, sift through information, curate my face, and give perfect responses or mask any discomfort for too long. And you will find when you unmask For those of you who hear me and have unmasked at times, you know what I'm talking about, where you will find people who do not read your facial expressions. They don't want to read your body language. They don't want to read your disinterest in their one-sided offloading. And they will continue and persist. And I have to say, that's when I tell them, start a podcast, because my neural pathways are overloaded right now. And I mean it. My energy unmasked isn't infinite. It's very capped. So with that said, I have to also be honest that what people describe as loneliness and seeking connection, I've come to realize I don't experience loneliness the way most people do. Because my inner world is very, very rich. So is my mind. So writing and doing things by myself, it gives me joy. But I realize that that's not how people describe loneliness. Is not for everyone. Because for most of us, it's not about being physically alone, because I never related. It's the absence of depth and curiosity in the people that I may pick to be around me. If I'm not met with the same curiosity, these days I don't try to make someone else be more curious. In fact, I become equally disinterested, but I also don't want to waste my words. Because why would I sit in a room full of people not seeing or hearing me voluntarily when I can choose when and with whom I can put my energy and engage? So, autistic loneliness, yes, that's a strange one. It teaches you, me, to value intentionality, to pick spaces and people who truly see you. Because there's nothing more painful than connecting with someone and being their bouncing ball, but you know that it's not reciprocated. Shallow interactions don't do it for me. And this is probably why a lot of people also don't like small talk, even if they're incredibly good at it. You have no idea how great I am at small talk. Let's talk about that weather. Let's dissect it. I can do that to maintain my energy levels. But that leaves us at the ending of this first podcast. How do we navigate these one-sided dynamics? How do we recognize spaces that see us and prioritize relationships that genuinely pour back into us? For me, it starts with understanding my worth, which spaces actually deserve my presence, and also setting sharp boundaries, because some people just don't know until they hit their head against a boundary that they never assumed was there. It's my job to ensure my boundaries there, to protect myself as well. Because it's okay to say, I need depth. I deserve reciprocity. And if you're listening today, I'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you navigate these dynamics? How do you find the spaces and relationships that truly nourish you? Because I know I'm not alone in these feelings. So if you're listening, I hope you know that you aren't either. Thank you so much for tuning into Lovette or Leave It. Until next time, I hope you really, really take care of yourselves and the people around you that love you and care for you too.